Members, the chair will call to order the Minnesota House Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice, Reform, Finance, and Policy Division. There is a quorum before us. Members, as you all know, we're going to be marking up the division's Omnibus bill over the course of the next, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, I think. How long it'll take us? Representative Poston moves, and all in favor? Now, this is obviously an important culmination of our work together as a committee. And just before we get into the work, I just want to express the chair's deep appreciation and respect for the work of every single member of this committee. There have been plenty of moments where we banged heads. I suppose there might be a few seconds where we might do that again. And as we put together the omnibus bill. But there also have been moments where I think we've deliberated pretty objectively and pretty professionally with the best interests of the people of Minnesota in mind. And I want to thank you for that, express my respect and observation of that commitment that you brought to the table. As we put together the bill today, I just want to lay out how we're going to proceed. First of all, we're going to start with testimony on the bill as it'll be brought up before us in a few minutes. We have people who have okay. So I guess we're going to do the author's amendment first, and then we'll have testimony from the public on the bill with the author's amendment. We have a number of folks that have asked to speak, and so I want to honor that. What I ask of all the testifiers, whether you work for our state government or you're a private citizen, is that you abide by our expectation that your testimony is as brief as possible. And so we have a lot of amendments. We have a lot of work in front of us. So I'm going to ask all testifiers to contain their comments to 2 minutes and under. I'm going to apologize ahead of time to everyone because once we reach that time with a particular testimony, I know how that goes. You get passionate, you get into it. I do it all the time. I will be interrupting and reminding you to please conclude your comments. And so please don't take that as a sign of disrespect or rudeness or even disagreement with your comments as much as facilitating an expeditious process here for the committee and to make sure there's plenty of time for other folks to also come to the witness stand and express their thoughts and expectations. We will move to amendments, and that's pretty much what we're going to be doing. We're going to be offering amendments and debating those. It's my expectation that that is going to be a member conversation primarily. There may be instances where it may be helpful in the chair's discretion that someone who's in the audience we may want to ask to come forward to help clarify something about an amendment, but it is not my intention to take testimony pro and cons on any of the amendments before us. That becomes particularly important, members, with a couple of real big amendments related to House File 8 and 9 in particular. That's the amendment. Those are the amendments that speak to 2 bills that this committee worked awfully hard to create strong, powerful, lengthy time for the public, pro and con, to come forward and express their thoughts and expectations and feelings about that. And so it's the chair's opinion that we've expended, and properly so, a good amount of time on those 2 issues. It's actually 1 issue, but 2 bills. And it's not my desire to have the committee redo, if you will, those many, many hours of testimony. So amendments, 2 minutes, please contain yourself to the public. Rather, initial testifying, 2 minutes to the public. Amendments, minimal to no public testimony, a conversation among committee members. Pretty much everything, probably 90% of what is before us in amendments and in the bill are topics that we have spent a hours discussing, debating, and shaping outside of the committee. And so it's my approach that we don't need to repeat that whole process all over again. Our objective here is to act on those things, construct our bill, and then move our bill forward and keep the session moving along in that way. I'm reminded by staff that you've got the packets here that has the amendments in them. They've divided them up, I think, by 5, so it wasn't one big jacket. They're asking, staff is asking, because we're not going to be able to conclude, well, maybe we will, but if we don't conclude by 2:15, please keep that together. They'll reinsert that into your folder, and that way when we come back, it'll be there for you. That really will help the staff, otherwise they're going to have to reproduce all that, put it all back together again for us. So please keep that in mind. We will most likely recess at the end of our scheduled time, and then we will reconvene. We're saying 6:30. Who knows? If session goes particularly fast, we're not particularly good at doing that as members of this body. But if it does, I'll make an announcement on the floor and try to get us back here a little bit sooner. And hopefully that'll be a way to respect the time that members have been putting in this week. It's been a long week. Sure would be good for, I don't know about you all, but it'd be good to get a decent night's sleep. And so watch for that at the end of session, and for the public as well. Please pay attention to that. It is the chair's commitment that we will bring up the amendments to House File 8 and 9 at a time certain. So I'm saying 6:30, so even if we start at, say, 5:30, we'll do that at 6:30. That should give particular members of the public who are here to hear that debate to know a time to be present for that. And so that's my commitment to you. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think not. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I'm really looking forward to the debate and to constructing an even better bill than the good bill that we have before us. So with that, the first order of business is to adopt the minutes of April 3rd. I'm wondering if anyone would be willing to. So moved, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Chair D moves adoption of the minutes of April 3rd. All in favor of that motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion prevails. Thank you, Chairman Dean. And then give me 1 second here. I just want to make sure I have it right. All right, members, the chair then moves House File 2792 be referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. That puts the bill formally before this committee. And of course, that is the committee Omnibus Policy and Finance Bill. And with that, we've the chair moves adoption of the A40 amendment. So this will be the chair's amendment. And for those in the public in particular, it's customary for the chair to bring in the First Amendment that largely does a lot of technical fixes to the bill as it exists at that moment, as well as bring in business that refers to work that we've deliberated over and that we've been negotiating among ourselves for quite a while. So what I want to do is just very quickly let you know, as soon as I find my notes, the highlights of what's in the author's amendment. Chair Mariani. And hold on a second. And then at that point, I'm going to ask our fiscal staff to very quickly walk through the amendment with an emphasis on quick. And then, of course, the amendment will be, as before us, will be open for debate and clarification from members. So Representative Johnson.
You covered what I was going to ask, if the staff could
Absolutely.
walk through it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Somewhat lengthy amendment.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. So the chair moves the 840 amendment. Let me give you quick highlights, not to be all-inclusive, but very quick highlights. As I mentioned, the 840 amendment brings in technical corrections to the bill. Not unusual for the public that bills constantly face technical corrections. There are a number of appropriation decisions within the author's amendment. Some of the highlights of that are appropriating statewide emergency management funds, appropriations for the School Safety Center, which will allow them to bring in 2 additional specialists. I think you all remember the testimony that they were shorthanded. The traffic appropriation for the traffic safety screening test for THC. This was Representative Quam's bill, modified, that produces a research and report. Appropriations for increasing the correction officers, so the prison guards, which is a major safety issue. Appropriations for the ombudsman, and I still have not changed that ombudsperson, but that's coming, Representative Considine. Appropriation for the reinstatement of the corrections ombudsperson. Appropriations for juvenile justice reform, funds for local counties. There's also some rider language related to, and there'll be a further amendment later, rider language related to the testimony we heard yesterday from African-American organizations working intervention at the street level in communities that allows for the targeting of grants for those communities and for their intervention practices as delivered through community-based organizations in collaboration with local entities. There is new language on opioid enforcement coordinator. It's quite simply acknowledging that as the state has been making investments in enforcement side relative to opioid enforcement issues, that there's a need for more effective coordination of those efforts. And so this is basically a message to the governor to move within the existing resources to create an ability to have that coordination happen. There's a pilot for correctional, there's a correctional facilities pilot program for officers and inmates in delivering mental health services. Some of us were at Stillwater when we sat with both guards and inmates, and it was painfully apparent to all of us that some real strong professional interventions and opportunities for both those populations of people were badly needed. And so this, in working with the Commissioner of Corrections, fashioning a pilot program that will look to find ways, or will deliver and learn from mental health services for both officers and the inmates. There's a lot of pages dedicated to the regulation of UAVs or drones. You all probably remember the discussion we had with Chairman Lesch's bill. I'm happy to report, we can talk more about it, that there seems to be a really good ground where law enforcement as well as civil rights communities, and quite frankly, both of those in my mind should always be synonymous. But in terms of advocates for those communities where they found some really good middle ground. There's language around the post-board expansion, the membership post-board expansions. There's a change to Representative O'Neill's Hannah's Law, which has been worked out. Thank you, Representative O'Neill, Representative Moeller, and Representative Pinto, related to the mistake of age. And so moving that to 48 months, which currently now, my understanding is at 120 months. And then there's also language, as we spoke about yesterday, we had forgotten to put in the admission interlock provisions that Representative O'Neill brought forward. Frankly, we're still working out some of the costs or potential costs to that, but we're feeling pretty confident that those are going to be resolved. So it's important to have the policy provision here. So those are just very quick highlights, and so at this point, I'll turn quickly to our House research staff, and I don't know whether that's Mr. Debo or Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. And I suppose Mr. Walsh, because of the appropriation provisions right up front, just to very quickly go through.
Mr. Chair, I think it would be easier to speak generally about all the page and line changes rather than to direct you to exactly where they are. And I can answer any questions after I just go through what this amendment is doing. The page and line, much of the number changes involve the deletion of certain riders and the moving of other riders. There is a couple of minor additions of money, and so I'll go over all of what was being done here. The first was there were, I believe, 3 riders that were deleted, and one was for an appropriation to the Department of Health for sort of this body scanner radiation making equipment. That is carried, and the money is carried in the Health and Human Services bill. So that was deleted from this bill. There was a $39,000 a year appropriation to the Department of Corrections for indeterminate sentencing. That has been removed, as well as the dosage probation for $200,000. That was removed. We were told by the department they could do those without the funding. There was an increase, if you have a spreadsheet on line 85 to House File 418. This was a Mueller bill for Criminal Sexual Conduct Working Group. There was slightly amended language, and so we took $14,000 of the savings and gave it to that working group in the second year. We also added, as part of House File 2709, Community Policing Database Grants, we provided originally in the bill $50,000 to the BCA to procure a database. We are now adding an OJP, $50,000 in the second year and ongoing, that will be available for the BCA to maintain this server, and the rest of the money or any remaining money will be available to which is on lines 4.12 to 4.18 of the amendment, will be available for a grant to a community-based research organization to maintain and update software to monitor peace officer discipline. Mr. Chair and members, as well, we delete any references to the opioid fund or appropriations from that fund, because there was a previous bill that passed that raised $20 million and spent all of it, so there's no longer any spending or references to an opioid fund. Mr. Chair, I believe other than that, there were a few remaining dollars left over, and those were put back into any reductions the original bill had made from the request for new guards at the Department of Corrections. And to my recollection, we have done no other moves of any money, and all of these page and line references are just to correct totals. We did insert a few other technical riders to further specify some of the spending that was already occurring in the bill. That is on the first page, line 1.1, the local government and emergency management rider, and on line 2.1, the school safety rider. Oh, Mr. Chair, I did forget one other thing. We did include on line 4.6, and this is new money. This is to the Department of Public Safety, OJP, on line 4.6, $100,000 each year is for grants to local or state law enforcement agencies to support the safe and secure storage of firearms. In addition to that, we have just moved some riders, and also, as the chair mentioned, there were a few riders for increased specificity that were recommended by the Department of Corrections. Those are in line 5.25, a prison population rider, just noting that they will get increases for in money in the forecast for increases in population. For the Office Ombudsman or person for corrections on line 6.6, and the Juvenile Justice Reform grants on line 6.15. So, Mr. Chair, if there's any questions, I could answer them now.
I think there is one question, but before I call it Representative Nash, and maybe I just didn't hear it, there was some adjustment with the sexual assault task force?
Mr. Chair and members, there was some amended language we included in this bill, which was not in the original bill that we heard in this committee. It slightly increased the fiscal note. We had that new language fiscal noted. It came back, and I believe it required an additional $14,000, which we provided in the second year, and that was taken from the savings of some of these other things that were eliminated that I mentioned before.
Very well, thank you. Oh, yes. Yeah, and the spreadsheets are coming. I just realized that we did not have it, so I've asked those to be brought over. Representative Nash.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for you, the author of the amendment on this. On line 10.32, you've changed the off-sale microdistillery licensing and sale of bottles. Can you help me understand that? And we have not heard that here. I don't believe that that was in commerce either. Just kind of curious as to the genesis of that and why.
Okay, very well. Yes, so I'm told that this is part of House File 1909, which was brought in by Chairman Lesh. But perhaps before I turn to others about that, perhaps we could turn to House Research to help describe what we're doing with this. Mr. Debo, please.
Mr. Chair, Representative Nash, members, this piece comes from the governor's public safety budget bill. It's part of Article 2 of their bill, and I understand that the agency has their staff here to explain the purpose of the language.
Why don't we have their agency staff come up and describe that language? And my apologies, Chairman Lesh, I thought this was in your bill, but it's in the governor's bill. Actually, I saw this morning, I think. That's what made me think it was a governor's bill. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. The language changed.
And I'm sorry, you'll have to state your name for the record.
My name is Carla Sincata, and I'm the director of the Alcohol and Gambling Enforcement Division. The language change that is provided simply just adds the language for the approval, or with the approval of the commissioner. This allows our division to approve a microdistillery license.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Nash.
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess I'm just a little confused. I've been the author of pretty much every substantive distiller's language since I got here. And when I carried the bill that allowed microdistillers to sell bottles, there was no mention of this. There was no concern regarding this, and they have gone on their way from a commercial perspective. Well, I haven't heard a thing from either the Distillers Guild or the department or anybody. And I would encourage you, if you would like to see just how many licenses and different things that distillers have to pull in order just to be a distiller. I'm not sure that this is information that is mysterious, and I'm just really confused as to the genesis of this language. And would ask the chair if you are willing to perhaps take a friendly amendment to amend it out so we can maybe have a fuller conversation, because I don't remember this having been brought up anywhere. And I think what you and I have talked about micro distillers, and you've got some in your district, this could be just another burdensome step for them. And to me, it seems like this should go to Commerce. I don't know if it's gone to Commerce, but Mr. Chair, I would ask if you would accept a friendly amendment to delete this so that we can actually have a fuller conversation and not negatively impact our distillers.
Yeah, for Representative Dash, I would be hesitant to take that action now, but I do hear your perhaps the validity of your question. Let me ask Ms. Seacott. It seems to me, as I look at the existing language, it reads, a micro distillery may be issued a license by the local licensing authority for off-sale distilled spirits. Then there's the addition with the approval of the commissioner. So there's an additional, apparently, decider here. And so I guess what I'm looking for is what are the public safety, commerce, and commerce is outside our scope, to Representative Nash's point, but what are the public safety considerations made when the commissioner was added as another decider to the local licensing authority?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this language is a technical change only. It brings the microdistillery licensing requirements, it brings parity, as it does to all of the other licenses. The license is issued at the local authority, and what it allows DPS to do is to go through the paperwork and approve that all of the criteria are met for licensure. It does not place any additional burden on the applicant or the licensee. There's no other costs associated with it. It just brings parity to the statutes and allows our division to approve the license prior to issuing it.
And that does seem fair and prudent to me. I think Representative Nash, I don't want to just dismiss your concerns with it. I certainly be willing to work with you, whether it's in carefully bound ways and means, because I don't like doing this, but on the floor if we have to. And in the meantime, between now and then, we can do a communications with the department to get some clarity, and maybe perhaps even, because if I'm hearing Ms. Seacon correctly, perhaps there isn't a major, policy change that's happening here.
And I'll be brief, Mr. Chair, so we can get on. But
Please, thank you.
Knowing the distiller industry in the state as well as I do, I might actually be, well, they call me their distiller nerd. I have lots of nerd hats, but I've spent a lot of time with these folks in their businesses, and I would dare say most of you have a distiller in your district or near your district. They don't need another hurdle. They don't need something to slow it down, and I am concerned that this could slow something down. They would do everything to keep their business afloat, and if they could mortgage their dog, they probably would. This is another step that seems to me to be onerous and burdensome. It's just going to slow it down, and if you come with me on a trip to a distiller, they've got, if you print out the little licenses and things that we require them, there's a couple of feet of licenses if you tape them together and hung them on the wall. I just don't know that, one, having a provision that's not been heard before until it gets introduced into the Omnibus bill is a smart way to go for us as a committee. But I'm just concerned that what is this going to do to a distiller? So for that reason, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to work with you, but I also think you could easily amend it back in if we would take my friendly amendment and remove that. We could always amend it back in if we came to the conclusion that it was a good piece and that the distillers were not negatively impacted. I just think that if we're going to be pro-small business, putting something in a public safety bill sort of at the 11th hour seems like it would be a little burdensome and onerous for them.
Representative Dash, I do accept the spirit of your trying to objectively problem solve here. I am hesitant to act on this at this point. You have my commitment that I will act if as we learn more, UI and Ms. Seacon and the department, and I'm even willing to bring that to Ways and Means and make sure we clean that up before, because I've been in those alcohol gambling distillery floor debates. I remember Representative, oh gosh, you forget folks as soon as they're, but I know this could be really difficult and tricky on the floor. So I certainly would prefer not to try to resolve that at that point. But thank you, duly noted. Ms. Seacon, I would request that you follow up with Representative Nash and with myself on this.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, absolutely, sir.
Representative Johnson. Thank you, Ms. Seacon. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, here's a couple things. I'm more and more that I look at your amendment of the 840. It's more than just technical. I believe it's more than just technical changes. On 10.1.
And Representative Johnson, I certainly did share that there are technical changes here, but I also, and I was not meaning to be comprehensive. We can certainly have our staff continue to walk through the policy provisions, because we didn't do that after Representative Walz, but Representative Mr. Walz. But I just want to make sure that the chair was not attempting to portray this as solely a technical provision, that there are in fact policy provisions in the author's amendment, skewing pretty closely to provisions that we have heard and debated before. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, it probably wouldn't hurt to go over some of the policy, because there's policy in here that we have not heard.
Representative Johnson, you are free to ask questions.
Yep, on line 10.1 and 10.2, it adds about the independent contractor with access to the federal criminal history records check. I wasn't aware contractors were able to access that through the state of Minnesota. I've sat through many hearings, both in judiciary and public safety and civil law, and I've never heard that. I'm wondering why they might have access to that data. So I don't know if the department is here to answer that question. I think that might have been in the governor's request.
It's a fair question, Representative Johnson. Why don't I ask
if we're going
someone?
to be hearing the governor's bill, we should actually heard the governor's bill.
Senator Johnson, we did hear the request from the department. I'll ask someone from DPS to come forward and answer your question on this provision. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members. My name is Drew Evans. I am the superintendent at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. As you noted, this was part of the governor's request that was heard in this committee, as was discussed. What this provision is this is a language change asking to include, to make it very clear in the statute, that background checks extend to contractors that would be working, that would be encompassed by the FBI CJIS security policy. And so what it's doing is it's clarifying in law that both contractors and employees are covered by this statute to do background checks on them. So we're in compliance with the FBI security policy.
Senator Johnson.
Okay, that gives me an understanding why they're doing that, but I have concerns because, like I say, there's quite a bit of things in here that we haven't discussed, like on 10.27 through 10.29. The reduction in the reduced cigarette ignition proponency account. We've never even discussed that account in this committee.
Representative Johnson, I think we can have DPS explain that provision as well.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Excuse me, I'm Bruce West, I'm the State Fire Marshal. And that provision is simply changing the account, giving the ability of the State Fire Marshal Division to access the funds that are in there from the collection of the reduced propensity cigarette account to use it for fire and life safety education geared towards smoking. As many of you know, that the #1 cause of fire-related fatalities in Minnesota is careless smoking or the discarding of smoking materials. So currently, we don't have access to the funds that are in there, in that account, the collected funds. We can use it for the person who goes out and checks the tags on the cigarette packs, but we can't use it for fire and life safety education materials.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, okay, I understand that a little bit, but I wish we would have heard that in committee. We didn't hear anything about that. And I don't even know if that fund's in our committee or Health and Human Services Committee. But there again, with these accounts, we have oversight over these accounts. We should be looking at these accounts, making sure that they're spending properly. If they need funding from that account for a certain thing, they should be coming and asking the legislature. That's probably why they don't have access to begin with. So like I say, there's a lot of things that we haven't discussed. I have an understanding why they want to do that, but I think we have to have oversight of these. We are required by our people who voted for us to have oversight over these things. And so that's why they come to and ask for things, but if we don't hear them, we don't know. Also, I'm concerned on 4.12 through 4.18.
Thank you, excuse me, thank you, Fire Marshal Marshall. And Representative Johnson, we have certainly had conversations on these, perhaps not on all the, we heard the requests from the governor. I remember seeing the Fire Marshal here several weeks ago talking about this access to this particular provision. I certainly embrace your desire for us to be super diligent in combing language. I think that's not inappropriate. But I also, for the record, members, do not want the public to get the impression that we're pulling issues out of air here and sticking them into this bill. These provisions come from our state officials who have offered, in some cases, general testimony about the need for these provisions. But Representative Johnson, please continue.
Like I said, Chair Mariani, on 4.12 to 4.18, that deals with the police officer discipline issue. I see you're moving it, so originally it was supposed to be at post board, they would be getting the information and logging it and keeping track of it. And the post board was going to maintain it. But now there's a 50,000 in the second year for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to maintain the community policing database for a grant to community-based research organization. That's outside agency. We have no control who's looking at it, having access to that private data. That makes me really concerned. And I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Representative Johnson. I do hear your concerns. We've attempted to address those issues. We had discussion in judiciary, particularly around the data issues of this. Part of the reason for having it at BCA is, in fact, to provide that level of protection of the data. I'm wondering if is the Commissioner DPS here? Commissioner, if you can come forward really quickly. Welcome to the committee, Commissioner. I just, back to this because I really want to make sure that we're moving forward with solid integrity here with the provisions that the chair is building into the amendment. You were with us at the beginning. You were with us at some point. And you presented the the department's expectations, hopes, requests of the legislature, including some of the provisions that were highlighted here. And so I'm just hoping that you can jog our memory of your presence and testimony at that time in terms of laying before this committee the department's requests.
Chair Mariani, my name is John Harrington. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety. And yes, I did, in fact, appear before you. I and Assistant Commissioner Bob Hawkins went through a lengthy PowerPoint deck that outlined all of our funded initiatives and also covered all of our policy initiatives that did not require funding, including most of the ones that I'm hearing you discuss today, the fire safety account, the issues around the alcohol and gambling, looking into or adding micro distilleries. All of those were as part of that original PowerPoint deck and were part of the testimony that we provided as we presented the governor's budget.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any further questions? All right, well then, members, are we ready to vote on the 840 amendment? Oh, we have amendments to the amendment. Very well. So, yes, okay. So there are amendments to the author's amendment. And Representative Long, you have the 850 amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move the A51.
The 851 or the 850?
A51.
Okay, very well. Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We heard my bill earlier in committee on trying to work towards having the Sentencing Guidelines Commission adopt a grid for probation. Representative Moeller, in our hearing on that bill, raised the astute question about how this would overlap with the Blakely Supreme Court case. We have been working to try to come up with an alternative that could meet the goals of trying to have a grid for probation and also not unduly be burdensome in terms of the Blakely procedural requirements. We are still trying to find that sweet spot, and so what this amendment would do is give us some more time and get the input of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. So would remove the language that is in the bill currently dealing with what we're calling early discharge targets, and this would give the Sentencing Guidelines Commission direction to come back to us by next year so that hopefully we can take this up in next year's discussions in the committee.
Very well. Are there any questions or comments? Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a little bit confused, Mr. Chair, because the language is written to the underlying bill, not to the amendment.
Representative O'Neill, why don't we ask the House Counsel that question? And the question is whether or not this amendment is written to the 840 amendment.
Just wondering if it's out of order, Mr. Chair.
I kind of suspect that's where you're going. That's why I want to make sure we're asking our House research. Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Chair and members, I believe the question about, or the decision about whether it is in or out of order is up to the chair. What I can offer in terms of advice is that on page 1, line 3, there is a reference to the A40 amendment that would insert new language. There's a similar reference to the A40 page and line at page 1, line 8. The language that is introduced would amend the underlying bill, the 2792 bill.
So, Mr. Chair, it does.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it does amend the underlying bill, not your author's amendment, but it's written, but I believe it's drafted incorrectly, isn't that?
So, so to counsel again, it seems perhaps we're repeating what counsel just said, but so it's the amendment then written to the amendment or to the bill as perhaps is being suggested.
Mr. Chair and members, if you look at page 1, line 3 of the A51 amendment, it references page 51 after line 27. That is a reference to the A40 amendment. That provision changes the A40 amendment by inserting language. That language is inserted after line 27 of the A40 amendment. The language that is inserted would change the underlying 2792 House file. Similarly, if you look at page 1, line 8 of the A51 amendment to the amendment, that would direct that there would be a change to the A40 author's amendment at page 22 after line 2. The change would insert new language which would amend the underlying 2792 House file.
Representative O'Neill, based on our conversation with House Research, and I guess and motion hasn't been called here, but my understanding, and it's the chair's clear understanding that both the intent and the effect of this amendment is to amend the A40 amendment. Representative Pinto?
Yeah, I just want to know, Mr. Chair, I don't even think it's not even a judgment call. I mean, it's drafted perfectly. If you look at lines 1.4 to 1.7, those are in quotes. Lines 1.3 and 1.8 are not in quotes, and that's because the direction in lines 1.3 and 1.8 are to do something to the A40 amendment, and what the thing to do is to put in the language in quotes, which itself modifies the underlying bill. So I guess I don't see this as being a problem in the least. I think it's drafted perfectly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very well. Representative
Mr. Chair, and to Representative Pinto's point, if you're changing an amendment to the main bill, really what you have to do is you have to, I mean, your bill, A40, is making changes to the main bill. So to make a change to the A40, you then would have to reference the changes that are being made to the main bill as well. So I would agree with Representative Pinto, with Mr. Johnson, and where the chair is, I think, leaning at this point.
Is there any further discussion on the A51 amendment? If not, all in favor of adopting the A51 amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
No.
Motion prevails. And Representative Dean, you have an amendment, and I think I juxtaposed, or what's the word where I confused the numbers. I think you have the A50 amendment. I initially thought Representative Long's was the A50, but we just moved the A51, so you have the A50 amendment?
Yes, I'll move that amendment, Mr. Chair.
Very well. Representative Dean moves adoption of the A50 amendment to the A40 amendment. Representative Dean.
Mr. Chair, what this amendment does is it takes some of the funds that have been allocated towards the youth intervention program in 2792, and it directs that half of the money of those portions of funds would be directed towards community-based youth intervention programs that work with African-American and African-American immigrant youth.
And Representative Dean, this is in reference to the conversation and public hearing we had yesterday.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Is there any discussion on the A50 amendment to the amendment? Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, I guess I'm not sure what to say on that. The youth in this, the work that youth intervention programs does is great throughout the state. There's challenges all over the state. And I'm sort of disappointed that they're taking half of it and dedicating it basically to a certain cause. When all these kids have challenges all over the state, and then you're taking money that could be used in one area that's close to me is the Blacks Reservation. That's taking funding at an area that's being ravaged by meth and other things. So I'm disappointed that you're taking 50% of this and using it just in one geographical area when there's not a lot of money compared to what we normally give to the youth intervention programs.
Representative Johnson, this is not appropriating half of the base $3 million that we appropriate to GIPA. This is 500,000 of one-time appropriations this year. I don't think it's accurate. In fact, I know it's not accurate to assume that young people in the African-American community only exist in one geographic part of the state. I guess I'm not being heard here. And so I might share your concern about earmarking. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. I don't think that's what this is doing here. Representative Dean.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and you know, to that point, I know that my presentation yesterday was about some specific work being done in my community, and although this says African-American and African-American immigrant youth, it's not just speaking to my community. This is money that will be appropriated that people will have to apply for and go through a process. And, you know, I would say that, you know, there are communities throughout the state that could actually apply for this money, and it's not just for inner city areas. So with that, I certainly understand how Representative Johnson may have made that geographical leap, but there's no intention to make this geographic.
Always good to have things on the record. Any further discussion? Representative Pinto.
Just really quickly, Mr. Chair, I note the language being deleted is actually from my bill that was directed to two specific organizations. So this amendment simply broadens that instead of picking the two organizations, it's broadening to a wider variety of organizations. And despite having brought that bill in the first place, I think this is a good change to allow multiple organizations to apply. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very well. Thank you, Representative Pinto. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor of the A50 amendment, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All same sign. Motion prevails. We have the A49 amendment to the A40 amendment. Is anyone offering that amendment? Representative Johnson moves adoption of the A49 amendment. Representative Johnson.
Notes disappeared. All this stuff. The A49 amendment deals with the pipeline.
Oh, Representative Johnson, you'll need to pull the, you know, I've been doing that too, so.
The A49 amendment deals with the railroad and pipeline assessment that was sunsetted, I believe, in 2017 and inadvertently not removed from statute. This account we never even spent any time on this account. It wasn't discussed, and were very little in the governor's budget overview. The language in the A40 imposes the assessment to the railroad and pipeline industry that was eliminated in 2017, sunsetting an imposed $2.5 million assessment on the, or $2.5 million tax on the industries for Department of Public Safety's activities. And to date, $7.5 million has been forcibly taken from those industries. What's interesting is where that money has been spent. It was supposed to be used to help different things and clean up, work on rail grade assessments, and it hasn't really been used there. It's been used for some education for firefighters and law enforcement. I've had those training in my past as a firefighter and as a law enforcement officer. But the training that the state is doing through that is minor compared to what the railroads and the pipeline industries actually offer training for free. In fact, I know there was one incident where I went to a training put on by the firefighters not involved in the pipeline industry. Their training was the exact opposite of what the pipeline industry was doing and what the state instructors were telling the firefighters to do was actually causing more harm. These accounts, and now because the state's been using that money for training, a lot of fire departments aren't calling the railroad industry for that training, and they do a much better job at the training. Also, $3.1 million of that has been used to buy equipment that has nothing to do with rail or pipeline. It dealt with the 9/11 equipment that had to be replaced. Yes, did that equipment need to be replaced? Probably, but it had nothing to do with what that tax was supposed to be used for. That's why it was sunset, and it was initially sunset, because to put the money aside to deal with those things, but unfortunately, we've used that money in the wrong areas, and I don't think we should require those same companies to fill up the coffers again because the money was misused.
Representative Johnson, you are correct. We did not talk about this at any extent, and so I'm certainly willing, the chair is certainly willing to ensure that we have a little bit more information before we act on your amendment. I think that's in keeping with what I shared earlier. I really don't want us to spend a constant public testimony on every amendment before us, but this one I think does fall within an area of needing a little bit more information that we have not heard before.
Yep, and I do believe there is a testifier here for the
Very well.
on this.
Yeah, and Mr. Appetz, I wonder if you can come forward. And then we'll ask the Public Safety Department to also have someone come forward and speak to this issue. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is John Appetz. I represent the Minnesota Regional Railroads Association. We really appreciate the opportunity to just speak to this because I don't think there's been a lot of discussion about this. Aaron Roth is with me. He represents the pipeline industry here in Minnesota. And let me say we appreciate this amendment. What it does is basically the amendment, the language in your amendment, Mr. Chair, reinstates an assessment that was sunset about 3 years ago in 2017. And it reimposes a $2.5 million tax assessment on the railroad industry and the pipeline industry for training and equipment that's supposed to be used along, according to the statute, it's supposed to be used along the corridors where the pipelines run and the railroad tracks where the railroads run. $7.5 million went into that account over that time, and we provide training. We have caches of equipment. We hire response and remediation contractors. The pipelines do the very same thing. And what we found is, in many instances where we've been offering training, it's been duplicated and offered from the department. So there's apparently, by their own accounting, about $1.3 million left in the account for the coming biennium. That's after spending $3.6 million on equipment this year. A lot of that equipment probably wouldn't be used to assess instances where you've got a pipeline or a railroad, because we know what it is that's in those cars, we know what it is that's in that pipeline. So I guess what we're saying is if you'd simply pause and kind of find out what the department actually needs this for, what it would be used for, and in fact, who should be paying for it, we'd appreciate it a whole lot.
Thank you, Mr. Appetz. And Mr. Lawson?
Roth. My name's Aaron Roth. I'm the executive director of the Minnesota-Wisconsin Petroleum Council, a part of the American Petroleum Institute, and I represent a number of pipeline operators in the state. And I would just reiterate what Mr. Appetz has just eloquently said. You know, a lot of this money will be expended on hazmat spills outside of the corridors, and we just don't think it's fair for the pipeline and railroad industry to pay for some of that equipment that will never be used. You know, we as companies purchase and train firefighters, in many cases contribute equipment to local firefighting units. And so, you know, as I told the commissioner the other day, if some of this is really in the public's good, we should be funding it out of the general fund and not out of the pockets of our members. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Roth. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, Mr. Roth, Mr. Abott, I just want to thank your industry for the training you do. You go to all the fire departments, the law enforcement agencies, do this valuable training at no cost to these departments. And I want to thank you for it because it's very good training.
Well, thank you. Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've heard this comment about we should just be funding it from the general fund, like that's somehow an unlimited amount of money that we have, and that it's not coming from other places. I mean, our state works because we actually take resources from lots of different areas, and then we use those resources in lots of different places. So, you know, I mean, I understand your concern about undoing a sunset that was in place and how that may impact the business model. But, you know, I mean, we all know that the general fund isn't an empty bucket that we can just keep going to. So I've heard that several times, and you just happen to be the person that heard it that sort of piqued my mind. So I just want to remind folks that the general fund's not a bottomless pit as well. Thank you.
So, Dean, I think that's fair and appropriate. I think also Mr. Roth was speaking about investments outside the corridors. So that begs the question, right, about whether that's happening, whether it's appropriate, et cetera. But that seems to me to be a fair question. Why don't we have the Department of Public Safety come forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And tell us what they're thinking, what they know, and perhaps also address this issue that Representative Dean just and Mr. Roth both raised. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Joe Kelly. I'm the Director of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Just to make a couple points relative to the conversation that the committee has been having, the funds in the account have been spent for two primary purposes, and I assure the committee that all of these are in accordance with the statute that created the account and our authorized expenditures. They involve training of personnel, they involve purchasing of equipment, and they did also fund $1.2 million worth of grade crossing improvements that was directed by the legislature. That money was transferred to the Department of Transportation. But the two primary areas that this account has funded since it was created, one is for community awareness training for communities that run along the pipelines and the railways. The department has conducted more than 400 different training sessions, 15 exercises involving more than 8,000 personnel. We don't view the training that we conduct as duplicative of what the railroads do. We view it as being complementary. In the cases where there might be some overlap and there is some redundancy, in our business, safety redundancy is a good thing. The difference between the focus of the training that the railway and pipeline companies prepare and conduct, which by the way is very high quality training. We do have great partnerships at the staff levels between the railroads and the pipelines and the Department of Public Safety. But their focus is on dealing with the incident on the rails or on the pipeline. The focus, so cleaning it up, putting out the fire, stopping the leak, et cetera, getting the trains rolling again. The focus of our training is oriented almost exclusively on the local fire departments and law enforcement's responsibility to control the scene and protect their community, especially until the railroad and the pipeline companies get there with their contractors and their equipment. And again, we have great confidence and respect for the work they do. So they are focused on the mode of transportation, the pipelines and the rails. We are focused on the communities. As I travel around the state to conduct training of elected officials, county commissioners, boards, mayors, and councils, when I ask them about the threats and hazards that they are concerned about, the things that could go wrong in their communities, one of the most common are incidents along the rail and the pipelines. To the other point about that some of this money has been spent to support our 11 state contracted hazardous materials response teams. As I believe it was one of the members of the committee, pointed out, it is a combination of money that comes not only from this account, but also from the fire safety account and federal grant programs. These are not specifically homeland security capabilities. These are all hazardous materials. So we say that every community in the state needs to have the ability to protect itself from hazardous materials accidents and spills. Not every community can afford that. The amount of investment in capital and training is high. That's why we have, for several decades, had 11 teams that are placed regionally around the state to respond in support of those local fire departments. So, Mr. Chair and members, that's how, in a nutshell, if you will, that is how that money has been spent since the account was created in 2015.
Very well. Thank you, Director Kelly. Are there any further questions? All right. So if not, then Representative Johnson renews his motion to adopt the A49 amendment. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
No.
Motion does not prevail. Members, that concludes then the amendments to the A40 amendment. And so if we're ready, I'd like us to vote on the A40 amendment. Very well. All in favor of adopting the A40 amendment as amended, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. No. Motion prevails. So House File 2792 is before us then as amended with the A40 amendment and its secondary amendments. Members, we have about 20 minutes before our typical adjournment time, and so we're going to begin the testimony on the bill that's before us. And I know that there are a couple of folks who cannot be with us later, and so I want to make sure that those individuals have an opportunity to speak to the bill. Oh, we're beginning with the executive agencies. Okay. All right. So, how many others? Oh, very good. So DPS and SEALs and corrections, if you can come forward and give us your quick testimony on the bill, and then I want to get in Mr. Jason Flores with American for Prosperity, because I think he's got to scoot out of town sometime soon. Commissioners, welcome. I'll let you flip the coin to see who goes first.
We'll go with the age first.
Oh, really nice.
Age before beauty.
Chairman Mariani, members of the committee, my name is John Harrington. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, and I've been reminded by my younger and better-looking colleague that I'm the elder of this group, so I got to go first. So we want to thank you and the committee for fully funding the governor's request. Your investments in the Department of Public Safety are incredibly important, and we believe they will help ensure that we will have an improvement in our statewide law enforcement response to sex offenders, including increased speed and reliability in our tracking of DNA. It will make sure that we have a fingerprint and an AFIS system that is reliable, as the system we currently are operating is end of life, and we are clearly out of compliance there and have a need for more than just a patchwork here. It will also make sure that we are FBI compliant in terms of cybersecurity, and that we continue to invest in both resolving the deficiencies that our hazmat teams have had in terms of making sure our deficiency accounts are up to speed, but also making sure that we have those hazmat teams well-trained and well-staffed. School safety, the number of cases that we continue to get requests for technical assistance continues to grow, unfortunately, and this bill will allow us to be able to respond more effectively all over the state of Minnesota. And then finally, we're very, very excited to begin the work on the Missing and Indigenous Women's Task Force. We believe that is long overdue, and we are very, very excited about bringing that into the portfolio of activities that the Department of Public Safety will engage in.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. Commissioner Schnell.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, again, my name is Paul Schnell, and I serve as the Commissioner of Corrections. I first want to extend my gratitude to the chair and all the members of the committee for allowing me the opportunity to speak to and make comments about the chair's public safety and criminal justice reform, finance, and policy omnibus bill. The governor and I are grateful that the chair's policy and finance omnibus includes the governor's budget and policy recommendations, as well as the range of sound proposals around criminal justice system reform, gender-based violence, accountability, and investments in our communities. From the beginning of the session, the top priority for the Department of Correction was maximizing the safety of Minnesota's prisons for our staff and the nearly 10,000 people incarcerated in them, along with the safety of our agents and the thousands of people they supervise across Minnesota. The emphasis on safety stems from the grim reminder of July and September of 2018, when Department of Corrections lost 2 officers in the line of duty, Officers Joe Gom and Joe Parisi. This emphasis reflects the reality that safety is the most basic of human needs. The deaths of these officers serves as a reminder of the inherent danger of service in the field of corrections and the need for our state to make investments in the security of its personnel and to bolster corrections staff and the safety of those incarcerated in our prisons. We want to specifically express our immense gratitude for the chair's budget, including the addition of 110 corrections officers, with about 90 of those positions being added in the upcoming biennium. And as the chair and members of this committee who visited our Stillwater facility and listened to the needs of our staff and those who incarcerated witnessed and heard, this investment in safety and security is truly an investment in programming that can help transform the lives of those in our prisons. It is critical that we remember that nothing happens inside a correctional facility without security personnel who have one of the hardest jobs in state government. The opportunities for those serving sentences in our prisons to access medical care, mental health services, treatment program, education, vocational training, and a variety of work programs are dependent upon the correctional officers. Given that 95% of those serving sentences in our prisons will be returning to our communities, offering programming is not nice to do, it is a necessity. Beyond the critical need for staffing, I'm thankful for the chair's omnibus, that the chair's omnibus bill includes balanced budgetary and policy provisions that have been identified as priorities by the Department of Corrections. Ultimately, as we go forward, we seek to and believe that corrections, the support for corrections reflected in the omnibus bill is truly a reflection of Minnesota's values for a criminal justice system that provides for needed accountability, but also reflects an emphasis on the redemptive potential of human beings. We again thank you and all the members of the committee for your time and work, and we look forward to our continued partnership to ensure for the safety of all Minnesotans. Thank you.
Thank you both, and you role modeled perfectly. That worked out to 4 minutes between both of you. So, but thank you also for your service to our state and for working with us in the committee to shape the language that's before us. Look forward to ongoing collaboration as we move forward in the session. With that, I'm going to ask of those who have signed up to testify in the bill, Mr. Jason Flores to come forward. Uh-oh, you might have caught that plane already, folks. If not, Melissa Lesh from the Justice Action Network. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Someone has to be home tonight, so thank you for thank you for letting me sneak in early. I do greatly appreciate it. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, my name is Melissa Lesh, and I represent the Justice Action Network, the first and the largest 501c4 organization in the country to bring together progressive and conservative partners and collaborate with law enforcement, business, civil rights, victims' rights, and faith-based groups to make our justice system more effective and cost-efficient. I'd like to thank the committee for including in your omnibus bill the provisions from Chair Lesch's House File 1061. This bill ends driver's license suspensions for unpaid traffic tickets. As you may know, a broad coalition worked on and supported this bill for the last 2 years, including city attorneys from the cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis and the state public defender, as well as community organizations from across the political spectrum. To name just a few, the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition, Voices for Racial Justice, the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition, the Second Chance Coalition, and the Minnesota ACLU. The Justice Action Network supports this bill because it represents pragmatic reform of criminal codes to end the systemic and systematic problems of over-criminalization. For thousands of Minnesotans and their families, the cost of a traffic ticket is an undue hardship, truly. Suspending a driver's license for an unpaid ticket often leads to job loss and mounting debt without improving public safety. And preventing people from driving legally to work hurts families, employers, and the community. National data indicate that 40% of those that lose their driver's license lose their jobs. Thank you so much for recognizing the need to end the practice of suspending driver's licenses for unpaid traffic tickets. This revision will make an enormous difference for many thousands of low-income Minnesotans who need to drive to keep their job, who haven't committed a dangerous driving violation, but who simply didn't have the funds to pay a traffic ticket on time. On behalf of the thousands of Minnesotans represented by our coalition partners, we do thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lesh, and thank you for the fine work of the Justice Action Network Coalition, working in a bipartisan, broadly collaborative way. It's important what you do. Thank you. So who's next? All right, Lars Nixstad from Isaiah. Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Nixstad. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lars Negstead. Time up already?
Next we'll hear from...
My name is Lars Negstead. I'm the policy director for Isaiah. Isaiah is a statewide organization of clergy, congregations, and people of faith working for racial and economic justice. Today, speaking from my own Christian faith, I'd like to lift up a brief passage from the Gospel of Luke. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, Jesus, found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That was the first time Jesus spoke in the temple, and I like lifting that up because he's quoting from Isaiah, our namesake of our organization. I'd like to thank the chair as well as so many representatives who brought so many good pieces into this omnibus bill. In particular, we're very excited to support the restoration of voting rights from Representative Dean, the probation reform pieces brought forth by Representative Long, the juvenile reform pieces from Representative Adelson, Noor, and Dean, limiting cash bail from Representative Noor, and also Representative Howard and Chair Mariani's efforts to increase and improve police-community relations with additional seats and venues for those discussions. Thank you very much for listening to our testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Nixon, and thank you for the work of Isaiah as well. Katie Kramer from NCBW. All right. If not, then Sue.
Oh, she's coming.
Oh, she is. Oh, there. Okay, I'm sorry. My 360 peripheral vision isn't what it used to be.
Chair Mariani, members of the committee, my name is Katie Kramer, Policy Director at the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. Thank you for leading the way here at the Capitol and making this critical investment to transform behaviors and prevent domestic violence. In the past 3 years, 57 Minnesotans were killed in domestic violence incidents. In more than half of those cases, the perpetrator had a prior history. This was a point where we might have changed their behavior and prevented the homicide. The solution to domestic violence is not to lock away a perpetrator forever. It's not to release them into the community without any programming. The solution is to promote programming that has been shown to transform behavior, to prevent future violence, and to save the lives of domestic violence victims. The solution is in programs like Step Up, a program of the refuge in Chisago, Isanti, Pine, and Kennebec counties. The Step Up program works with men who have perpetrated domestic violence. They fund this program solely with some of their thrift store proceeds and thus are only able to run one group each year in each of these counties. This is a program that has a recidivism rate of less than 10% and a program where there's a constant demand for more groups in those counties. 40% of our counties in the state have no programming. While $783,000 will start an investment in this programming, it will not go far enough. I want to thank this committee for allocating $783,000 a year to support domestic abuse transformation programming. This will mark the first time in the state that the state has appropriated money to support programming to transform behaviors of perpetrators. While we are extremely grateful for the money appropriated, I ask that you consider increasing this allocation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Kramer. And we have Sue Abderholden from NAMI.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Sue Abderholden, Executive Director of NAMI, Minnesota. I want to thank the committee for adding some key provisions in here. The first of which is the restrictions and transparency around solitary confinement, an issue that NAMI has worked on for several years. And we appreciate actually also including some additional mental health staff. The second is reinstating the Ombudsman for Corrections. Again, this is a multi-year effort for us. We think it's a wonderful way forward to make sure that people, particularly those with mental illnesses, both in jails and the prison system, if they have problems, can actually go to someone who can look into it. We have always supported funding for police training. We understand there's concerns with the data collection around discipline against police officers, but we also see it as an opportunity to evaluate those training efforts. We very much support the JDAI initiative. Over 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system have one or more mental health diagnoses. It is our poor and children of color's mental health system, and we need to make sure that we move those children out and into an appropriate place. We support the pilot for the mental health community supervision. We think that makes a whole lot of sense. We also support the parenting skills. We know that one of the adverse childhood experiences is if you have a parent who's in the prison system. And lastly, we just want to suggest on the cannabis task force that you add a mental health professional. Mental health professionals are very concerned about this issue, as is the mental health community. We prefer it be a psychiatrist. The psychiatrists have really delved into this issue quite a bit. Again, that would address many of the concerns that the mental health community has. Again, we appreciate many of the great provisions in this bill, and thank you for your efforts.
Thank you, Ms. Abderholden. I've had the privilege to work with you over a number of years, although heavily in the E12 community and now in this sector as well. Thank you for your fine work over the years. Ben Feist from ACLU. Is Sherry here? Okay.
Mr. Chair, members, Ben Feist, Legislative Director at the ACLU of Minnesota. It would probably take me more than 2 minutes to just go through the provisions of this bill that I like, and I will not be doing that, but just suffice it to say, a lot of ACLU priority issues were included here, and we really appreciate the work of the committee this session. I will speak very briefly to the drones provision that was put in. Thank you for keeping this issue alive for this session and moving forward. To be clear, there were a number of concessions that the ACLU didn't like, and law enforcement still doesn't like it 100% either. But we are happy to continue talking about that and glad that it is moving along. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Feist, that was so efficient. Tell us a couple other things you like in the bill.
Mr. Chair, I love voting rights restoration, the fines and fees reform with the driver's license suspension, bail reform, great work on probation reform, the cannabis task force, and changing the other limits there for the marijuana crimes. I could probably go on longer, but that's just off the top of my head.
Mr. Feist, I've had the privilege over the years to work with the ACLU in interaction with Senator Limmer from the other body. And the three of us teamed up to do, I thought, some very important work around the Real ID a decade ago. I am really hoping that, that at least part of that will transfer into an ongoing productive conversation with the other body in the coming months. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sherry Munyon. Is she here?
Mr. Chairman, members of the community, my name is members of the committee.
My name is Sherry Munyon, and I'm here today representing the Association of Minnesota Emergency Managers. And we want to thank the chairman as well as our co-author, Representative Brian Johnson, and the author, Representative Marquardt, for the funding that's provided in this bill for local emergency grants. This will be the first time that our local communities have received assistance from the state of Minnesota to help them with emergency preparedness. So they are very thankful and asked me to extend that information to you. They will be using this money locally for training as well as other preparedness activities for kits that prepare them for on-site disasters and also for other equipment that will move them forward. Although this doesn't impact all of the communities, the 87 counties, 11 tribes, and 2 cities, having 15 communities be able to move in this direction is a fantastic start. So we thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Munyon. I think really good policy that's needed across the state, and I'm particularly pleased that we're able to do this in a bipartisan manner. So thank you, Representative Johnson, for joining us in that effort. Thank you, Ms. Munyon. Lorna Schmidt, American Heart Association.
Mr. Chair, do you feel like you're Drew Carey at this moment?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you. My name is Lorna Schmidt, Government Relations Director for the American Heart Association. I can be very brief. We want to thank you for including telephone CPR in this bill. This important provision will help ensure that all of Minnesota's 911 telecommunicators are trained to either coach callers through starting CPR while help is on the way, or able to transfer those cardiac arrest calls to another answering point whose staff can. It will strengthen our EMS response system, and it will save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schmidt. I'm wondering, members, we're about to adjourn, but if there's anyone that can't come back that had asked to speak, I'd be willing to extend this out a few more minutes to get your testimony in. And while people think about that, Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, I don't know if you, the other members received the email dealing with the telephone CPR, but the secondary points that the locals shipped to for the medical already, they, from what basic reading I've seen on their letter, willing to train all our emergency 911 operators in telephone CPR already.
Very well. And I don't see anyone else coming from the audience. And so at this point, we're going to recess. We're aiming to be back at 6:30 in room G3. Room 5 at State Office Building. Lee Johnson, I'm told that room 5 at the State Office Building is available, and there is television access there. Does that sound like a good? All right. So let's plan to come back in room 5 at State Office Building at 6:30, unless you hear otherwise. On the floor, we will certainly send an email out to all members and the public. Please stay tuned. So until then, this committee stands in recess.